Okay, I'll get this started. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Deb Russell. If you haven't met me yet, I'll introduce myself in a second. I'm really excited that everybody wants to hear about why businesses employ people with disabilities. And I hope that through this webinar, you learn something about why businesses do this. I'm devoting 2021 to helping businesses understand better the benefits of employing people with disabilities and how to do it in a way that ensures they get those benefits. So this is the beginning of a series. We'll be doing these webinars once a month. Now that you've registered for this one, you'll be on a mailing list, so you'll be aware of the next ones. And each one will require separate registrations, but that's okay. And each person who registers, whether you attend the webinar live or not, you'll get a recording via email so that you can watch the replay. All right. So the reason that companies do this is very simple. It helps them achieve their goals. All companies have goals, they have metrics, they have strategies. They want to ensure that their business is healthy and continues to thrive. There's a lot of reasons that businesses do that. Very simply, it's so they can stay in business, continue to employ the people that they do, and serve their customers. So, can hiring more people with disabilities help your company? Yes. Very simply, yes, it can. I think that having worked with the companies that I've worked with, this has been the easiest answer for everybody once they've had a chance to figure out how to employ people with disabilities. And I should back up a second and just say the abbreviation PWD stands for people with disabilities, in case you're not familiar with that. So this gentleman's going to answer the question. Yes, indeed, hiring more people with disabilities does help your company. So you might be asking, well, how do you know? First of all, as I said, my name is Deb Russell, and I know this because I was lucky enough to create Walgreens' successful initiative to employ people with disabilities. And I'll be reviewing a lot of the benefits that we received during that time. And then I'll be talking about other companies' benefits that they've had employing people with disabilities. Because when we started this at Walgreens in 2006, we were the first company to do this in a national format, to look at this large scale, to have the intention of having it be something that we learned how to do in one pilot site and then could extend enterprise-wide. We started with our distribution centers, and then we took what we learned there and applied it to our retail. So it's an adventure that I was allowed to participate in and orchestrate for 6 years. And it was incredibly rewarding and challenging all at the same time. I came from the world of serving people with disabilities, helping them get jobs, talking to businesses about employing my clients, people with disabilities who are looking for jobs. That's the world I came from when I entered Walgreens. And what I learned from Walgreens was how private companies work, how they operate, why they operate, what's important to them, how are strategies devised, what do you do when you encounter things like the economic crash that we had in 2008. I was there during that and watching the impact that had and the company's revitalization after that, and being able to respond to that and ensure that we could serve our patients and our customers and continue to thrive as a corporation. So we took the benefits and the strategies of being a company and we combined them with people with disabilities and the disability community, and leveraged my knowledge of how the disability community is supported in employment efforts and how some of the disability community is not supported in their efforts for employment, but we wanted to be able to access everybody. So we used a very simple formula. When I came into the job, this formula had already been written, and it was written by our Senior Vice President, Randy Lewis, who is the parent of somebody with a disability. And the formula was very simple. What we did needed to be good for customers, for employees, and for shareholders. Those were our stakeholders. That was who we needed to keep in mind as we made all of our decisions. when we were deciding how were we going to employ people with disabilities, what was that going to look like for our company, we also considered what does it look like for our customers, for all of our employees, for our shareholders, and anybody else that we considered a stakeholder. We didn't take this very lightly. So there were so many benefits that we were able to achieve through employing people with disabilities. There was performance. We had retention benefits. And we had brand benefits. And I'm going to discuss those in the beginning of this. And then I'm going to go through the rest of the benefits that other companies have experienced. So engagement, untapped labor pool, improvement and innovation, as well as compliance and governmental incentives. These are your primary buckets of benefits that companies experience when employing more people with disabilities. And I have met people from companies that have not experienced any of these benefits. And I can track it back to how they employed people with disabilities. So because I know that the how is equally as important to the why, we'll be talking about how a little bit as well. So how do I know this? Very simply, we collected the data. We wanted to be sure that we could talk about the success that we were having. Other companies have collected data as well. The government has been very interested in this and studying it. Lots of research projects all around employing people with disabilities because their goal is to help save money in taxpayers' dollars. Private foundations and universities have been researching this and collecting data and creating pilot sites and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of information from them as well. But as far as I know, we were the first ones to really study the why and the how at the same time. We were an experiment as we kept moving forward. I consider us an airplane that was learning to build itself as we were flying in the air. We started out having some assumptions. Some of those assumptions were true. Some of them were not. We leveraged a lot of individuals who are experts to help us determine how can we do this, again, in a way that's fair to the employees, the customers, and the shareholders. So, Walgreens' story in a nutshell. It's hard to talk about in just a nutshell. That was 6.5 years of my life, and the best 6.5 years of my life, I have to be honest. It was such an adventure to start with a clean slate and to just figure out what are we doing? How are we going to do it? And we experimented with a lot. We tried a lot of things that did not work, and we tried a lot of things that did work. And it was just that continual commitment to figuring out how to do this within the context I described. We called those the guardrails, making sure that what we were doing was fair to those stakeholders. In addition to that, we were committed to some very basic premises. One was that all jobs would be available for people with and without disabilities. We weren't going to hold jobs for people with disabilities. We weren't going to prevent people with disabilities from going into any role that they were qualified for. We had a mantra that was same job, same pay, same standards, same benefits, side by side. This wasn't going to be outsourcing. It wasn't going to be an enclave. It wasn't going to be a segregated setting within the buildings. This was something that was completely integrated, completely competitive, meaning that everybody was held to the same standards, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it was complete employment. Individuals with disabilities didn't have somebody else paying their paychecks. It was us. It came from us. And those are really important aspects of the program. And knowing that when I talk about the data, that is how we got this data, was through those methods. So we engineered our efforts to employ more people with disabilities to ensure that we got those results. So when I'm talking about the results, please keep in mind that we engineered this. We started out knowing that the results that we were aiming for were the results we were looking for. We also got some other results, but we started out with some very clear pictures about ensuring that standards were adhered to, our processes were respected, and to ensure that we were also really mindful of the fact that when we were making decisions, we were doing so knowing that we wanted to share these lessons with other companies. So they needed to be replicable. We started in one pilot site in Anderson, South Carolina. It was a building that was being built at that point in time, so it seemed like a great starting point. And then we learned lessons there. We moved on to the next building, used the same model, learned what was different there, and then we're able to support all of our distribution centers, new and old. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to call them old. New and legacy facilities, teaching them what we had learned, helping them be able to leverage the same approach that we had to employing people with disabilities in Anderson. And then from learning what we learned in the distribution divisions, we went over to retail, understood that practice, had to tweak the model significantly to make it fit for their strategic imperatives and the way they operate. And then we were able to create success there as well. Along the lines, we were helping a lot of companies learn what we had learned and taking them through a lot of tours. So I say all of that to just be clear. It worked. What we were trying to do, we were successful in doing. Our goal was to have 1/3 of the workforce that was coming into our employment roles be people with disabilities. We didn't always hit that goal, but in some buildings, our percentage of people with disabilities was 30 to 40%. Those were buildings where we started at the beginning. We didn't have to use just attrition or growth to be able to intentionally bring in more people with disabilities. But even in our other facilities, we were seeing 20%, 18%, 15%, 25% of the workforce becoming people with disabilities as they were bringing in new employees. Our goal for the entire division for supply chain, which is 10,000 people, our goal was 10% of that workforce would be people with disabilities by the year 2010. We actually missed that goal because of the economic recession in 2008. We achieved it in 2011. So at that point, we got to 10%. When I left Walgreens at the very end of 2012, we were at 11% of the workforce for supply chain. The goals for retail were different. Retail wanted to have 10% of their workforce that were coming in be people with disabilities. And so we geared our program that we designed for them around that. So it was a process. And again, always keeping everything fair and balanced to the stakeholders. And one of the stakeholders that we realized we had, but we didn't start out thinking was a stakeholder of ours, was the disability community. So that they got added into the idea that we wanted everything to be fair to all stakeholders that we were engaged with. And we did it all because we wanted to share this with other businesses. Randy Lewis is an incredible man who had this great vision that he could figure out how a big company like Walgreens could employ people with disabilities at a significant scale, and how we could then teach that to other companies that we knew were different, whether in size or in industry or geography or whatever, but we wanted them to be able to benefit from what we learned. So again, the intention was to be able to create these great results that I'm going to talk about. So what we learned was that we could not reproduce the results in every single workplace. Some success in our efforts was dependent on 3 factors. It was dependent on the culture and the leadership of the building. Some of the facilities that we were working in had been in existence for 25 years and had incredibly low turnover. That was a very stable and somewhat insular culture that was in that facility. Whereas we had other buildings where we had other things going on in the community. And so it was a much more fluid culture where things changed significantly often and people easily went with the flow. The second factor was really the hiring. Were we hiring people with were we hiring people into these workplaces? Because if you're not hiring people, you can't hire people with disabilities. So, like I said, we had some facilities that had very stable cultures. They had little turnover. They maybe hired 1 person a year. And so in those buildings, it was challenging to think about how can we help them employ people with disabilities when they are employing. It was a very different model we needed to use in those places. The third factor is the community and the resources that come with the community, because Walgreens' success was built on relationships with entities in the community. And that's really crucial. That was the most variable aspect of everything we did, was finding out how could we partner with entities within the community. Because most people with disabilities are attached to a community, whether it's a local community, it's a service provider, it's a neighborhood group, it's church, some sort of community. And how does that community look at employment? And how does that community look at employment of people with disabilities and support it? So we had some communities where things were not supported, where many of the people there just didn't think that employing people with disabilities was something that a company should be embarking into. I say that just not because I'm trying to call people out, but to say there are factors that are outside of your control sometimes. So when you're looking to employ people with disabilities, you do need to look at the community and see what resources you can leverage. Sometimes those resources, community resources, are internal to your company. One of my clients, not Walgreens, has had significant referrals for employees from their current employees. Their current employees have family members with disabilities or know people with disabilities within the community, and they've been the segue to get individuals with disabilities into the employment ranks at those companies. So the community is a very, very important part. And I say that this is the triangle that disability employment success sits on, is that three-legged stool right there. So we'll cover the how of accomplishing all the success that I'm going to talk about in our March webinar. So again, this is a monthly webinar series. It's a free webinar for everyone. And if you want to be aware of the topics and how to enroll, please feel free. Just know that you'll get an email after this webinar with the replay link and information on how to register for other webinars if you haven't already registered for them. So today we're talking about results. I think that the why is more important than the how. And that's been my experience with companies. So we're going to be talking about the why. Why would companies want to do this? What results can they expect? So here we go. Today, we're about the why. We're about the results. At Walgreens, performance was our key metric in the supply chain. Performance was everything. We had 6 key metrics for it, and we aimed everything at those metrics. As we were determining whether we were successful in employing people with disabilities, we were looking at the buildings and the departments' metrics that they needed to achieve, and none of those were about people with disabilities. Our goal outside of that, my goal, was to make sure that we were employing people with disabilities as we achieved those results. So our performance was outstanding. It's incredible what we were able to achieve. I didn't even understand the scope that we were going to be engaging in when I started out. And I started as an advocate for people with disabilities. I've always been an advocate for people with disabilities and their employment, ensuring that people with disabilities have a level playing field. But even I was skeptical about whether or not they would be successful in this environment. These distribution centers were fast-moving, highly production-oriented facilities. Accuracy was also important. So within the productivity, that's the speed. How fast were people working to create the results that needed to be created? And very simply, in a distribution center, boxes are coming in and boxes need to go out. And that's your productivity. It gets broken down. It's much more sophisticated than that. And if anybody in the audience is from supply chain, I am not minimizing at all how complex those operations are. Just trying to be mindful of not everybody in the audience is from distribution centers. But productivity is about speed. Accuracy is obviously about making sure that you're doing the work. It's quality, that it comes out the way it's supposed to look when you're done. Safety actually probably should be at the top of that list of the performance indicators. Safety is number one in distribution centers. We have a lot of moving equipment with humans interacting with them. There's the potential for a lot of risk. OSHA does a great job of providing regulations around that, but you also have to have practices internal to your operations to ensure that everybody's safe. Because if everybody's not safe, then it's just not a successful operation. And honestly, that can sink an entire company. So safety was number one for us. Attendance. If people don't show up, work doesn't get done. So attendance was a very key metric for us. And reliability. It's not just attending, but being on time and being ensured that individuals um, are doing what they're supposed to be doing when they're supposed to be doing it. And finally, teamwork. Walgreens was a great teamwork environment. Every distribution center I've been to has a very team-oriented work environment. So that was those were our 6 major metrics that we were looking at day in and day out, and that we were measuring all of our employees, including employees with disabilities, against. So let's talk about that for a second. Our standards were determined by the pace of the equipment, or also by the needs we had with the stores. So our job was to get the product to the stores. We would get trucks in from the vendors, we would sort that out, divide it up, and get it shipped out to the trucks. So if you've ever shopped in a Walgreens store, and if you haven't, I recommend that you do, they're lovely stores. Go into a Walgreens, you'll see Kleenex on the shelves, toothpaste, all sorts of products. Pharmaceuticals are behind the counter, obviously. Well, there's over-the-counter ones also. Food, all sorts of different products, a huge array of products. Those products come into the distribution centers, we sort them out, and we get to the stores so that when you, as the customer, are walking into the store, if you want a tube of toothpaste, it is on that shelf. When you are walking in, there aren't any spaces on the shelf. Well, that was what our goal was, to make sure the stores were always stocked with what they needed for the customers. So the machines that we had running in the distribution center kind of set the pace, but also so did the need for the customers. That was the other thing that really set the pace for us. And so all productivity was built around that, meaning if we needed this truck to leave at that point in time with everything on there, then the people in the building needed to get everything onto that truck before the time to pull it away. All employees were required to achieve 100% of whatever the standard was for their job. So if their job is to unload trucks, then the speed that we expect them to unload that truck is the standard that was held for everybody. If it's about picking product and getting them into the totes that were going to go to the stores, the productivity was set by how fast those machines move those totes through. And again, like I said about the shipping standards, were set by the pull times for the trucks, which were all set by the point that we needed to get the product to the stores. It's all interrelated. So we hired and retained employees with disabilities who could achieve these standards. Sometimes people didn't work out. A lot of people exceeded the standards, just like people without disabilities. When I came into the job, I don't think I had fully understood how that was going to play out. I certainly didn't. But the idea was a great idea. I just wasn't sure that people with disabilities could do it. And I was blown away by what we saw. In case you don't know this, you can terminate people with disabilities for cause, for lack of performance, just like you can fire everybody else. When I was starting at Walgreens and we were talking about metrics for success for our initiative, one of them was that when we started to terminate individuals with disabilities for cause, it meant it wasn't a good match. After they had received the supports that all employees receive, or any additional supports that were accommodations, if after all of that they couldn't be successful, then it just wasn't a good match for their skill set. So I think sometimes people call that cherry picking, but I wouldn't. That's just simply employment. Whatever job you're in right now, assuming that you have a paycheck or that you've been working recently, you understand what the expectations are of your job. You may not like it, but you know what those standards are. And if you don't achieve those standards, if you don't produce the results that they're looking for, then you're not going to be employed for very much longer. So this is a key point, that the results that we got were the results that we wanted because we designed our program around that. But remember, it didn't impact the ability to employ people with disabilities. We employed a lot of individuals with very significant disabilities, obvious ones and ones that you couldn't see. People who had never been successful in employment before, people who had only made sub-minimum wage in a sheltered workshop environment and had never been at 100% productivity. They came into our facilities, they got the training, sometimes they had a job coach, and they were successful and they stayed. That's just very simply it. That's how we did it. We held people with disabilities to the same high standards that we held everybody there. And really, the myth that had been prevalent, and still is for some reason, was that you can't fire people with disabilities. So I just want to say it one more time. It is perfectly legal to terminate anybody, no matter what their gender, age, veteran status, disability status, religion, any of the other protected statuses, if it's for cause. You can't fire somebody because you're being biased against them, but if they're not producing the results and you're holding them the same standards you're holding everybody else to, and you've got the documentation, then you can fire them. And that was our metric. And I think that people thought I was kind of cruel when I set that metric. But as we went through the experience, the managers and the HR folks who had been a little skeptical of that idea understood, because it gave us a lot of legitimacy to what we were doing. And it ensured that what we were doing was fair to all of the stakeholders, the employees, the customers, and the shareholders. So we never hired someone because they had a disability. I want to say that 100 times over. We worked hard to develop a pipeline of candidates with disabilities through outreach, through partnerships, and through other methods to ensure that we were hiring people with disabilities. They were in our pipeline of candidates. We were interviewing people with and without disabilities at all times in our applicant pool. But we never hired anyone simply because they had a disability. We hired them because they had a disability and they could do the job, or we were pretty sure they could do the job, or they had already demonstrated to us that they could do the job. Some people with disabilities trained for over a year to gain the skill set to be offered a job at Walgreens. So the commitment on their side was equal to the commitment on our side about this quality. So let's specifically talk about safety for a minute. Like I said, that was the number one metric, or concern, I should say concern, for Walgreens and for many distribution centers that I have worked with and manufacturing plants. Safety is a very crucial aspect of operations and workplaces. And even in workplaces that you don't think of as safety as a concern, like working in an office, safety is still really important. So we had fast-moving equipment, high-tech things, cranes that went up in the air, forklifts running around. I can't even explain all of the kinds of safety risks that exist within a distribution center. It's very fast-paced, a lot of moving parts, a lot of heavy things that could crush you. Safety is very important. And so what happened? What we were expecting, and this was my bias, and I kind of spread it across our leadership team, was we assumed that people with disabilities would be safer than all employees. We thought we're providing so much training, or well, not we, our partners, understand how important safety is to us. They're providing so much training and really emphasizing this with people with disabilities. Maybe they're going to be safer because we really hammered this point home, and we've made sure that they understand how to be safe. As an example, one of our partners was very concerned about the cognitive skills of the people that they were referring for employment to understand bloodborne pathogen safety. I don't even understand it all that well. So they worked really hard to ensure that they had a safety curriculum that would ensure individuals were safe using those processes and safe enough to pass the quizzes that OSHA requires. So it was really important that everybody understood where safety fit on this. But we were really surprised because people with disabilities were not safer. And that shook me to my core until I had a chance to really look at what that meant. So we collect a lot of data. In the data analysis of safety over 3 years, we had an average of 34% of the workforce were people with disabilities across 4 buildings that we were studying. And we had a higher number of recordable safety incidents, almost 20% higher, for people with disabilities. It was crushing to me. I really thought, oh, how could we not have noticed that people with disabilities are less safe? And then we looked at, really, what does this mean? Well, the rules are that if anything happens, it's recorded in an incident report. And in that incident report, you describe what happened. And the key to the statistics that we were analyzing was that first aid was the highest amount of need for our employees with disabilities against the employees without disabilities. Not because they get cuts more often or bumps or bruises more often, but because they report it. Because they are told the rule is if you need a Band-Aid, you need to report it and get the Band-Aid. Whereas I was finding that many of the workforce there who didn't have disabilities, they would just go get a Band-Aid or find a Band-Aid and not report it. So it turned out to be a reporting glitch in our data. And I should say very carefully, I knew who had reported that they had a disability. Most of the managers did not. Some of them they knew because they came with job coaches and there were other obvious ways to tell. But we had a massive workforce of people with disabilities. And most of them it was a hidden disability or a disability you couldn't see. But with the safety data, we could prevalently see that people with disabilities, for whatever reason, are safer when it comes to what happens to them with the safety incidents. They are very literal about the rules related to safety, and they follow them. And so what we found was we had a higher number of recordable safety incidents, like I said, but they were mostly scratches, cuts, and bumps, nothing like that. When it came to significant safety incidents, which is what we were really concerned about, the lost days, time lost due to a safety incident, was significantly lower. Look at that graph on the left-hand side that's showing the data. It's showing that people with disabilities had a 40% lower average of time lost after a safety incident. So if they were in an accident or something else happened where they had to take some time off from work due to that injury, they came back to work much faster. Not necessarily different incidents that caused the time off, but they came back faster. And as a result of that, and just some of the level of the incidents, like I said, first aid was one of the highest rates of need for safety interactions with, or safety mediation. That meant that the cost of safety incidents was significantly lower for people with disabilities. And this graph on the right-hand side just shows that people with disabilities were, on average across the board, all of the expenses related to safety, they were 67% lower. Some cases, they were 78% lower. I mean, it's just a significant impact of having people with disabilities in the workforce when you look at safety overall, and you look at one of the major factors related to safety, which is the budget associated with that. So the next thing that we were curious about was retention. We studied this for a long time. I have to say that I started out with the assumption that retention would be a little bit higher for people with disabilities, that we would see turnover because, again, we were holding people to standards. So not everybody with a disability was successful in that environment from a productivity standard. And so I was a little concerned. But what it turned out to be was that people with disabilities had 42% higher retention, 52% higher retention, 48% lower turnover. That blew me away. I just couldn't believe that. And I redid that data about 6 times to make sure that the statistics were valid. Making sure that we had people coded correctly, whether they had a disability or not. Again, I was the only person who had that information, a couple other people, but so that I had to code the data so that somebody could run the statistics. So it was just an overwhelming revelation for me as an advocate for people with disabilities. Like, this was my job, but before that, before I came to Walgreens, my job was to help people with disabilities get a job, and I just assumed that that needed to be not holding them to the same standards, that you had less expectations for them. That was what I thought about when I came into the job at Walgreens. And after seeing this in data and seeing the experience in the building, spending all of my time in distribution centers and in the stores with the employees who have disabilities and the employees who don't, and seeing the level of potential was just incredible. So the other thing that we did not expect was the brand. It blew my mind. We were very lucky to have significant media coverage of what was going on in our distribution centers as we started to employ more people with disabilities and designed our models for that. And within that, we got some national media coverage, which was fabulous. It educated the country about what we wanted to do and what we were doing so far. And the response to that was more significant than any news coverage Walgreens had had up until that point. And Walgreens is in the news a lot, so I was surprised. The experience that we had the response that we had from consumers was that they didn't know Walgreens was employing people with disabilities, although we thought we were talking about it all the time. It hadn't made national news until this kind of coverage. And our customers were either pledging their alliance to Walgreens forever because we employed people with disabilities, or they were converting from some of our competitors to bring their scripts and their business over to Walgreens because Walgreens was employing people with disabilities. I know there are some consultants out there that do a great job of really measuring this and talking about it and teaching companies how important brand is. But it wasn't our intention to do anything to Walgreens brand. We thought the brand was pretty good to begin with. But the response from the consumer was just incredible. The other thing that we got out of that from the consumer response was them saying, I have a son with a disability, or I have a sister with a disability, or somebody down the street has a disability. Somebody I know has a disability, and now I have hope for them to have a job. Because Walgreens isn't just employing people with disabilities, Walgreens is teaching other companies how to do this. I now have hope. That was definitely not something we expected. And that was such a wonderful surprise to get in relation to brand. So those were the benefits that Walgreens experienced. That's why Walgreens continues to employ people with disabilities, to get those responses. But there are other companies, like I said, there were a lot of companies that came and learned from us and took it back to their own corporate grounds and figured out how to employ people with disabilities, whether they were retail companies like us or other sorts of different industries, whether they had supply chain or not, whether they had retail or not. And so I'm going to share some of the results that those companies have shared with me, and also some things that I've read about that weren't actually my clients. So, like I said, we didn't study this, but employee engagement's really important, and it's becoming more and more important. When I was at Walgreens, we actually didn't even measure engagement yet. They started doing it at some point during my tenure there, but it just wasn't a big aspect on our radar. And then all of a sudden, I started working with other companies, especially Procter & Gamble, which is well known for their engagement. They have great engagement with their employees, and they work hard at it. Again, companies that are known for doing things really well, they work hard at it. Zappos, another company known really well for their engagement with their employees because they work hard at it. They want to make sure their employees know that they're valued. So we didn't start out studying it, but others have. And Procter & Gamble is just a great example of where they were very careful about measuring engagement. And so when they started to employ people with disabilities in a very distinct location, they could look at the data. And they did see an uptick, which is hard for them because they're already a really great company. But they saw that. And I've heard about that from other companies. So that's a great reason for companies to employ people with disabilities as well. That's one of the great whys. The other impact on brand is backed up by data with others. And I said this before. There are a lot of consultants that study this specifically and actually do great work related to brand. And so one of the things is that improving your brand, making sure that the world knows that you're employing people with disabilities, improves your candidate flow. So if you're employing individuals, you're going to get a higher caliber of candidates through the fact that you are an employer intentionally of people with disabilities as well as everybody else. And diversity in general provides an improved candidate flow. You become an employer of choice, which allows you to take the best of the candidates. You don't have a pool full of sludge that you're pulling from. You are pulling from the greatest candidates there are out there and picking the ones that are at the top of the peak. The other thing that I think is so impressive, and I don't do work in this area, but I have a lot of respect for the individual who does, is what happens to people's share price. Not everybody's a publicly traded company, but there are a lot of publicly traded companies. And those companies, when they employ people with disabilities and they're public about doing that, they have a better share price. So I think everybody wins here, no matter how you're looking at brand, whether you're looking at how customers perceive you, how your potential candidates and your employees perceive you, or how your shareholders perceive you in Wall Street. It's just that's a benefit and a reason why companies do this. Another one that's not so relevant right now, although it still is an untapped labor pool. So I was working in consulting, helping companies employ more people with disabilities throughout the time when our unemployment rate dropped down to 3.2% or 3.1%, depending on where you were. It was significant. Companies just could not find candidates. There just wasn't enough available workers for their demand. And so people with disabilities became a very significant untapped labor pool that allowed companies to be able to fill their worker roles and be able to make sure that they could get the work done that they needed to get done. Now it's a different story about the untapped labor pool, because during the time that we are right now, this is being recorded during the pandemic, we do have a higher unemployment rate. So that would make you think that we have more candidates available. But because of the pandemic, we don't. A lot of people are staying safe, they're staying home, or they're receiving the unemployment benefits that are significant. And so for them, it doesn't economically make sense to go out and get a job. So we still have a need for candidates, even in this very tumultuous economic time. So the untapped labor pool, and I'm going to reveal a little bit of the how here to say that it's so important to ensure that when you are recruiting people to fill your roles, that you are making sure you're not creating inadvertent barriers to people with disabilities. And you may have to do a little bit of extra outreach to ensure that they're in your pipeline of candidates. And again, that'll be March's webinar. But it's not just saying I'm employing people with disabilities. Sometimes you have to do a little bit, but you get so much back from it. Another reason that companies employ people with disabilities is because of innovation and being able to create new ideas and to actually be able to make a difference within the company. This is very significant for tech companies, but all companies really can benefit from innovation. It's not just tech. We're always looking for new ways to do things, new and improved ways to do things within our companies. And people with disabilities many of them come with a different perspective, just like all sorts of diversity dimensions. So it's not that every person with a disability is incredibly innovative, but the experience of having a disability, and I can speak from experience myself, means that you do think differently. You've had to do things differently. You've had to consider things differently, and it gives you a slightly different perspective. And with that different perspective, then you can really make a difference inside your company. Especially, and I'll go back to tech companies for a minute, because IBM has been a company that's employed people with disabilities for, I think, over 100 years now. Francis West will have to correct me if I'm not quite right on that number, but they've been employing people with disabilities for a really long time. And some of their best workers are individuals with sensory disabilities, so people who are blind or people who are deaf, because it helps make sure that the products that they create are accessible to everybody. And that's really important. When you're selling a product, you want the entire world to be able to buy it. You don't want your product to create barriers for some of the consumers out there. That's just a basic business thing there. So that's really key. Innovation is an aspect that I think is so interesting to watch and to really monitor. And so many companies say this. I can't even rattle off every tech company that says that employing people with disabilities really helps their innovation. So for companies that are hyper aware of innovation, people with disabilities is the reason that they employ people with disabilities has to do with the innovation. And again, that goes back to every metric I talked about. For Walgreens, our metric in supply chain was all about performance, productivity, safety, attendance, those sorts of things. That was what was important to us, and that was what we measured, and that's where we saw the proof and the benefits that we could talk about. Other companies, like tech companies, where innovation is so important, that's what they talk about, is the benefit of employing people with disabilities. That's their why. The final benefit is compliance and governmental incentives. And sometimes I think that this gets a bad rap, but people with disabilities do provide companies with help in compliance requirements. Any company that's a federal contractor in the US needs to achieve goals about diversity, and people with disabilities fit into that. And sometimes those goals aren't quite set yet, and it's just about what are you doing to get to achieve that goal. And so Section 503, which came in 2013, I think, really impacted some companies, especially federal contractors, where most of their business comes from the US federal government. It's important that they make sure that they're compliant. And employing people with disabilities does help their compliance. Also, there's governmental incentives, tax credits, grants, all sorts of things that can help a business. And when they're trying to do different things, the compliance and the governmental incentives, that helps their bottom line. It provides them with a profit. And so that's important, or at least a balanced budget. Sorry. So being able to ensure that your company is healthy across all monetary lines, across all humanity lines, again, looking at your stakeholders, which are your consumers or customers, your employees, and your shareholders or the owner of the company, whoever's got a financial stake in that company. Those are your stakeholders, and you need to make sure that you can, as a business, you can provide the results that they're looking for. And this entire webinar is about the fact that people with disabilities can provide you those results that those stakeholders are looking for. And they can do it really easily. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to be able to figure out how to help a company do this. So, what does this all mean? Why do businesses hire people with disabilities? For results. It's very simple. People ask me this all the time. How hard is it to get a company to employ people with disabilities? And I'm kind of baffled by the question. It's not hard at all, because I'm going to help them get the results they're looking for by employing people with disabilities and doing it in a way that's engineered to ensure that they get those results. That's how everything that a business invests in, every new step that a business takes, is geared toward achieving those results so that they can stay in business, continue to employ the people that they employ, to be a part of the community, and to continue to solve people's problems. That's what business does, and employing people with disabilities does that too. So, I guess I've already hammered this point. You get these results because you design it that way. You set yourself up for success by saying, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do it in a way that makes business sense. The business case for taking these steps, the steps that it takes to employ people with disabilities. Because if you were already doing it, then you wouldn't be attending this webinar. So the people who are wondering why are generally also wondering how. You get these results. How do you get the results? You get them by engineering your program to employ people with disabilities, your efforts, your partnerships, everything that you do around it to ensure that you get those results. That's why businesses employ people with disabilities. It's very important to keep that in mind. If you are somebody who helps companies employ people with disabilities, that's an effort you need to be thinking about. When we want to make sure that businesses are successful and we are a partner within that success, it means that we are helping them engineer the results they're looking for. And this can be a little bit challenging. And if there are folks out there who help businesses employ people with disabilities, please check my website, because I've got a lot of resources for you as well. If you are a parent of somebody with a disability, or a loved one of somebody with a disability, or you're a person with a disability yourself who's looking for employment, keep in mind, companies don't employ people with disabilities because they have a disability. They employ them because they're people who have something that can offer a value to them. And that value generally is tied to the metrics that are most important to them. So that's a nice tactic to take when you're talking to companies about employing people with disabilities. So I'm going to be honest and say I'm not really sure how to take questions on this. So I think there's a Q&A tab, but I'm not sure I know how to leverage it. So pardon me for a second while I move around in this and see if there's a way to catch the questions. If not, I just don't know how to do this. Okay. I'm going to just say I'm happy to answer these questions at any point in time you've got. There's my email address. There's my website. Please forward any and all questions to me, and I'm happy to answer them. Sometimes I use those questions to create LinkedIn articles because I think that it's something that everybody's wondering. Sometimes I do it as an email post to people. And if I see questions from this webinar, I will answer them and then create a summary of all of the questions and answers and send that out to everybody so that you all can benefit from the questions that others are asking. As I said, when this webinar ends, I'm going to make sure it gets captioned, and then we're going to be sending out the replay so that you can access it. If you didn't take screenshots while you were watching this webinar, of course, you are welcome to take screenshots when you watch the replay, share the replay with others. This is information everybody needs. It's information that every business needs. And it's information that everybody who cares about a person with a disability needs. I spend a lot of time debating with advocates and with loved ones of people with disabilities about whether or not people with disabilities can work or should work. And my belief is that they can and they should. We just need to find the right business, the right opportunity where whatever skills they've got, whatever attributes they have to offer will be valued and will benefit a business. So I thank you very much for your time. I really enjoyed explaining all of this to you. I hope that you'll ask me questions. I hope that you'll check out the resources I've got for you. And I hope that you will employ people with disabilities and encourage other people to employ people with disabilities. Thank you to whomever put out that comment. Oh, Anne-Marie, thank you. I really appreciate it. If anybody, okay, so Anne-Marie figured out how to get the chat going, and now I can see it. So if anybody wants to put anything in the chat, that's a question. I will stick around for just a couple of minutes more to answer that. But again, otherwise, I encourage you to send questions to me and ask any questions that you've got. Over any point in time, you can find me on LinkedIn a lot as well. That's where I spend a lot of my time when I'm not actually working with my clients. Okay, I don't see anything else in the chat. Thank you, Anne-Marie, for showing me how to use that. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful day.